What is a seam and how much do you need your seam allowance to be? So first of all, what is a seam? So a seam allows us to sew 2 or more pieces of fabric together, and it means that our fabric isn't going to come apart because you've got this extra bit of fabric here, which is your seam allowance. That means the stitches aren't just going to come apart because they're not super close to the edge. So there's different amounts of seam allowance you add to your sewing patterns, or you'll see on sewing patterns you use, depending on the look you want to get and the fabric you are using. So if you want to hide these raw edges, you'll generally have wider seam allowances so that you've got enough fabric to be able to hide these edges here. But if you are just leaving the raw edges because it doesn't matter, or overlocking them, you'll probably have about this amount of seam allowance here. So generally the seam allowance I recommend is a 1 centimeter seam allowance, which is 3/8 of an inch. And I've got an ebook here where I've got all about the seam allowances, which ones you can use, how much to add on your patterns for them. You may find on your sewing patterns, they generally do a bit more, which is a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. You don't actually need this much, and you'll generally find they tell you to trim it off. So when you're making your own sewing patterns, I really recommend a 1 centimeter seam allowance for all of your normal seams. Now, if you have a really thick fabric, I would recommend doing a slightly wider seam. And if you have any of these other types of seams, so your French seam, your double stitch seam, your flat felled, your bound seam, you will want a wider seam allowance so that you can hide the fabric within that. So if you're looking at seam allowances, I recommend downloading this free ebook that I'll link below so that you can work out how much seam allowance you need for your pattern and check that you're adding the right amount when you're creating your sewing pattern so that it doesn't matter when you sew them up. And when you're adding your seam allowance to your patterns, you can use your pattern cutting ruler and use these increment lines here to be able to easily add your seam allowances and your hem allowances as well.